Magic Johnson, five-time NBA champion, more than 4 decades as an icon of joy and composure on the American basketball court. A living legend who redefined the meaning of the point guard position in the modern era of the league. From no-look passes that ignited entire arenas to the fiery rhythm of the Showtime era, with the Los Angeles Lakers, he conquered the biggest sports stage on the planet with confidence, discipline, and a smile that seemed never to fade. Millions of fans saw him as the embodiment of energy, of optimism, of an era when basketball wasn't just a game but a festival. But behind that spotlight was a story not of glamour but of profound challenges. A childhood of poverty in a large family in Lansing, Michigan. Cold mornings when his parents worked non-stop to feed the household. The years carrying the expectations of an entire city on his shoulders as the tall boy's talent began to draw attention. Then the enormous pressure of fame when he became the face of an entire league, a superstar America believed could never fall. And then came the fateful night in 1991, at age 32, at the peak of his career when he heard 2 short words from the doctor, HIV. In an instant, the smile that once lit up arenas became a symbol of fear. The sports world was stunned, fans were devastated. Many believed the Lakers legend would soon vanish from life, that his biological clock had begun counting down. But what few knew was that Magic Johnson's real battle didn't start on the court. It began in the silence of hospital rooms, in long nights when the future suddenly became more fragile than ever. And now, at 66, as the years have passed, as the heartbeat that once made crowds leap to their feet now beats more steadily under the peaceful light of life, one question still quietly echoes in the shadows of fame and memory. What really happened to Magic Johnson, the man the whole world once believed would die young, but lived long enough to tell his own story? If the story of Magic Johnson makes you curious about what really happened behind that legendary smile, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring his extraordinary journey together. Behind the glow of blazing arenas and endless cheers, Magic Johnson's story actually began in a place very far from what the world imagines. In 1959, in the city of Lansing, Michigan, a boy named Irvin Johnson Jr. was born into a large working-class family where hope always existed but hunger and scarcity never left. The home where he grew up wasn't the shining image of the American dream that television often portrayed. It was a small, cramped house where the footsteps of 9 siblings echoed in narrow hallways, where beds had to be shared, and where every meal had to be carefully portioned to feed everyone. His father, Irvin Johnson Sr., worked at a General Motors plant, a grueling job that stretched for hours in hot, noisy factories. Each day he came home with rough hands and clothes soaked in the smell of machine oil, carrying the exhaustion of a man who knew he'd have to do it all again tomorrow. Magic's mother, Christine Johnson, had no privilege of rest either. She took on whatever jobs she could, cleaning schools, doing odd chores around the neighborhood, anything to bring a few more dollars home. In that house, love was always present, but money was almost never enough. Dinners were often painfully simple. Some days the food was divided so thinly that each child learned to eat more slowly, as if stretching every bite would make the hunger fade. Magic Johnson later recalled evenings when he'd look at his plate, then at his brothers and sisters, wondering if everyone would be full before tomorrow came. But poverty wasn't the only thing that shaped that boy's childhood. Lansing in the 1960s was an industrial city where the black community lived closely together in small neighborhoods, where churches, schools, and outdoor basketball courts became the center of life. In those neighborhoods, kids learned to grow up early. They saw their parents work themselves to exhaustion, heard stories of men losing jobs, and understood that the world outside didn't easily open doors for their dreams. Magic understood that very early too. He saw his father rise before dawn and return after sunset. He saw his mother exhausted but still forcing a smile for her children. And in the quiet, he began to realize that life wouldn't hand him anything. He'd have to take it for himself. As a young boy, Magic often carried an old basketball to the concrete courts near home. They weren't beautiful venues with fresh rims and bright lights, just worn-out hoops, cracked surfaces, and faded lines almost erased by time. But for that boy, it was the one place where poverty didn't matter anymore. There he could run, jump, and dream of a world much bigger than the streets of Lansing. Yet even in those moments reality stayed close. After every session, Magic had to return to the small house where bills still sat on the table and his parents still worried about tomorrow. It was in those years that he learned the first lesson of his life: hope and hardship can coexist in the same home, and sometimes it's homes like that which produce the strongest wills. The boy Irvin Johnson didn't yet know that one day the whole world would call him Magic. He didn't yet know his smile would become the symbol of an entire basketball era. All he knew back then was that life wasn't easy, that his family fought every day to survive, and that if he wanted to change his fate, he'd have to start from the worn-out courts of Lansing, where the biggest dreams are sometimes born from the poorest places. The years that passed in Lansing didn't make life any easier for the boy Irvin Johnson Jr., but they began to change him in ways no one could have imagined at the time. As he entered his teenage years, one thing made him stand out above all the other kids in the neighborhood. He grew so tall so fast that almost no one could keep up. While his classmates were still short, Irvin shot up, with long arms and wide strides that made him look like an adult lost in a world of children. But being different was rarely welcomed in the school hallways. At Everett High School, many students looked at him with curiosity, sometimes with mockery. A lanky, skinny, awkward boy in the early stages of his body's growth often became the target of unkind jokes. There were days Irvin walked down the halls hearing laughter behind his back. There were afternoons he quietly left class without saying much to anyone. But instead of shrinking away, he turned to the one place that made everything simple: the basketball court. There, his height was no longer something to be ashamed of. It became an advantage. And every time the ball touched his hands, Irvin felt he had his own language to speak to the world. After school, when many friends had gone home or gathered on the streets, he often stayed on the court. The afternoon sun slowly faded over the concrete surface, but he kept practicing. Repeated shots, quick sprints along the baseline, imaginary passes to teammates who were never standing beside him. His shoes wore down with every session, and his hands grew calloused from holding the ball too long. But for Irvin, every hour spent on that court was a small step out of the cramped life his family was enduring. He wasn't just playing ball to win, he was playing because he knew his family needed something bigger. On the evenings he returned home after practice, he saw his father still exhausted from his shift at the General Motors plant, and his mother still trying to hold everything together for 9 children. In silence, he began to understand that his dream was no longer just his own. It was the hope of the entire family. By his senior year of high school, those relentless hours of practice began to work miracles. In a game at Everett High School, Irvin Johnson stepped onto the court with a confidence few had ever seen in a teenager. When the game ended, the scoreboard recorded a number that stunned the entire arena: 36 points, 16 rebounds, 16 assists. It wasn't just an outstanding game, it was a rare, complete performance for a high school student. In the crowd that day was a local reporter taking notes. After witnessing the no-look passes and ball-handling moves that made the audience leap to their feet, he shook his head and said a line the whole world would later remember: "That kid really has magic." And from that moment, the name Magic began to appear. At first, it was just a nickname in a local article, but that name quickly spread throughout Lansing. Friends called him Magic, coaches called him Magic, and gradually, Irvin Johnson began to realize that this new name carried more than just praise. It carried expectations, it carried pressure, because from that moment on, he was no longer just a tall boy in a poor neighborhood. He had become the hope of an entire city. When Magic stepped onto the court, people waited for miracles. They waited for unimaginable passes, explosive drives that set the game on fire. But few saw what was going on in that teenager's mind when the arena lights went out. In the quiet moments after every game, Magic was still just a boy returning to the small house where 9 siblings shared every meal. He still saw his father rise before dawn to go to work. He still saw his mother struggling to keep the family from falling apart under hardship. And in those nights, Magic understood something important. The name Magic could make entire crowds cheer, but it was also a reminder that he was not allowed to fail, not just for himself, but for everyone placing their hopes in him. So he kept practicing, kept running, shooting and passing until his hands ached and his legs trembled. He didn't want to be a kid famous for one high school season and then disappear. He wanted to become something bigger, something strong enough to change his own life and perhaps the lives of his family too. And while all of Lansing began calling him Magic, he still thought only of one simple thing: he would never let circumstances make him small. But before the NBA world knew the name Magic Johnson, before giant arenas roared every time he touched the ball, there was one moment in American basketball history that changed everything. After years of shining at Everett High School, Magic Johnson left Lansing to begin a new chapter at Michigan State University, carrying not just his talent, but the hopes of the entire family and city that had raised him. There, the boy who once practiced on cracked concrete courts began facing a much bigger world, where every game was watched, every mistake magnified, and every victory carried growing pressure. But fate seemed to have prepared him for a showdown that people would later call the moment that divided all of America. In 1979, the NCAA championship game was held, and at opposite ends of the court stood two completely different men. On one side was Magic Johnson, tall, dynamic, always smiling, representing the bright rhythm of Michigan State. On the other was Larry Bird of Indiana State University, quiet, cold, almost mysterious, a man from rural Indiana with a simple but razor-sharp playing style. Two people, two personalities, two worlds. When the game began, the entire country seemed split in two. One side backed Magic Johnson and Michigan State's fiery style of play. The other believed in Larry Bird's patience and composure. The arena was packed with fans, but what made this game different was the millions watching on television. It wasn't just a college basketball game. It was the clash of two emerging icons, and though no one knew for sure what the future held, there was a feeling that history was being written right before their eyes. Magic Johnson entered the game with his familiar energy, lightning-fast passes, long runs across the entire court, and the confidence that made his teammates believe nothing was impossible. But on the other side, Larry Bird remained as cool as ever, moving precisely, scoring with seemingly simple but unstoppable shots. The game became a battle of minds, strength and will between two men who seemed born to face each other. When the final buzzer sounded, Michigan State won. Magic Johnson and his teammates became NCAA champions. But more importantly, that game shook the entire American basketball landscape. Millions watched on television. Analysts began talking about a new era of basketball, and the NBA's top executives realized that the names Magic Johnson and Larry Bird could become the center of a great rivalry in the future. But for Magic Johnson, that victory wasn't just glory. It was the moment his life stepped into the harshest spotlight. From the boy who grew up in a cramped house in Lansing, he was now a name known across America. Newspapers wrote about him. Professional teams tracked his every move. And for the first time in his life, Magic Johnson clearly felt the weight of national expectations. The NCAA win didn't just open the door to the NBA, it placed him on a path where every step was watched, where mistakes were no longer a young player's private matter, but a topic for the whole country to discuss. In that moment, Magic Johnson still smiled as always, but deep down, the boy who once played on Lansing's concrete courts began to understand that his life would never be the same again. The 1979 game divided America into two sides for one evening, but it also did something far more important. It transformed Magic Johnson from a college talent into a figure the entire sports world would follow for decades to come. And that spotlight, brilliant but brutal, was only just beginning to shine directly on his life. After the 1979 NCAA championship game, when the final buzzer sounded and the trophy was raised high under the arena lights, Magic Johnson's life took a turn there was no coming back from. The boy who grew up in a cramped house in Lansing was no longer just a college star. The whole country had seen him. Sports analysts talked about him. Professional teams started tracking his every move. And when the summer of 1979 arrived, the biggest door in the basketball world finally opened. In that year's NBA draft, Magic Johnson was selected by the Los Angeles Lakers. For many young players, making it to the NBA was already the biggest dream. But for Magic Johnson, that dream immediately became a brutal challenge. Los Angeles wasn't like Lansing. It was the center of lights, of media, of enormous expectations. The Lakers at that time weren't just a team. They were a brand of victory. And from the moment Magic put on that purple and gold jersey, the whole world wanted to know if the kid nicknamed Magic truly lived up to the name. The pressure hit the 20-year-old rookie harder and faster than any shot on the court. Commentators asked questions. The press followed every game. Every mistake was dissected. But Magic Johnson didn't shy away from the spotlight. In fact, it seemed like he was born to stand in it. Right in his first NBA season, Magic brought the Lakers an energy the team had never had before. No-look passes that made fans leap to their feet. Lightning-fast breaks that turned every game into a show. And most importantly, he made his teammates believe they could beat anyone. As the season went on, the Lakers started going further than many had predicted. Wins followed wins. The Forum Arena became a place where dreams began to take shape. And then what no one was sure of at the start of the season actually happened. The Lakers reached the NBA Finals, but the biggest test still lay ahead. In that year's Finals series, the Lakers faced the Philadelphia 76ers, a strong and experienced team. The series grew even more tense when superstar Kareem Abdul-Jabbar got injured and couldn't play in the decisive game. For any team, that could have been the end. But on the night of Game 6, Magic Johnson stepped onto the court with a bold decision. He would play center. A 20-year-old rookie, playing a position that wasn't his, in the biggest game of the season. It was a gamble. But that night became one of the greatest performances in NBA history. Magic Johnson ran the floor with endless energy. He scored, passed, grabbed rebounds, and controlled the game's pace as if he'd been playing that position his whole career. When the game ended, the scoreboard showed a number that stunned the entire sports world: 42 points. Not only that, he had crucial rebounds and passes that created scoring chances for his teammates. The Lakers won. The buzzer sounded. The arena erupted. And right then a historic moment was recorded. Magic Johnson became the only rookie in NBA history to win Finals MVP. As he stood on the court, sweat still on his forehead, that familiar smile appeared again. But this time, the smile wasn't just the joy of a young player. It was a sign that something much bigger was beginning. Across America, the newspapers the next day all said the same thing. A new legend had been born. The boy who once played on concrete courts in Lansing had now conquered basketball's biggest stage. But while the world praised Magic Johnson as the NBA's new miracle, few realized that from that moment on, his life would never be normal again. Because when a rookie does what no one had ever done, the spotlight doesn't just shine, it starts to burn. And Magic Johnson's journey under that harsh light was only just beginning. But if 1979 marked the birth of a phenomenon, then the 1980s were the era when that phenomenon became a dynasty. After his shocking performance in his first NBA Finals, Magic Johnson didn't just enter the world's biggest league as an outstanding rookie. He entered as an emerging icon. And with the Los Angeles Lakers, he quickly became the heart of a dynasty that people would later call by a name full of light: Showtime Lakers. Los Angeles in those years wasn't like any other sports city in America. Hollywood lights, lavish parties, movie stars, and sleepless nights turned every Lakers game into a cultural event more than just a basketball game. When Magic Johnson stepped onto the court, music played, fans stood up, and the Forum Arena felt like a grand stage where every moment carried the feel of a performance. And at the center of that performance was Magic Johnson. His no-look passes left crowds speechless. His fast breaks turned every possession into a cinematic moment. Teammates ran to his rhythm as if he were directing the entire game in a language only he understood. Throughout the 1980s, the Lakers didn't just win, they dominated. The team won a total of 5 NBA championships, and Magic Johnson became the heart of every one of those victories. He won 3 league MVP awards, led the NBA in assists multiple times, and became one of the most recognizable faces in American sports. The NBA Finals matchups between the Lakers and the Boston Celtics, where he continued to face his friend and greatest rival, Larry Bird, turned basketball into a dramatic story that the entire country followed. But the brightest light always comes with a price. When Magic Johnson stood at the peak of the basketball world, his life no longer belonged to him alone. The NBA schedule became brutal, dozens of games each season, red-eye flights from city to city, long practices, and the constant pressure to always win left his body little rest. Mornings waking up in strange hotels, long flights in winter, and high-stakes games turned the life of an NBA superstar into an endless cycle. But the pressure didn't just come from the court. Los Angeles was the city of lights, and for a young superstar like Magic Johnson, the doors to every club, every party, and every event were wide open. Life off the court started to get more complicated. Nights of partying, fleeting relationships, and the fast pace of Hollywood became part of his world. To many it looked like the perfect picture of a young superstar, talented, wealthy, and famous. But deep inside, Magic Johnson still carried the memories of the boy who grew up in a cramped house in Lansing. He still remembered the evenings when his family divided every meal. He still remembered his father coming home smelling of machine oil after shifts at the General Motors plant. And those very memories made him understand that everything he had could vanish as quickly as it appeared. The dazzling NBA spotlight made Magic Johnson one of the most famous men in America, but it also placed him under a pressure few could imagine. Every game had to be won. Every season had to prove he deserved superstar status. And every time he stepped onto the court, millions were waiting for the next miracle. In the rare quiet moments between flights and games, Magic Johnson sometimes wondered how long that pace could last. But when the game buzzer sounded and the ball touched his hands, those thoughts disappeared. He smiled again, ran down the court, and passed like it was the most natural thing in the world. The whole country saw the shine of Showtime Lakers and believed that dynasty would last forever. But like every light that burns too bright, it was also illuminating shadows that no one had yet noticed. And while Magic Johnson was living the most glorious years of his career, fate was already preparing for a moment that would change not just his life, but the way the world looked at a disease that at the time was almost synonymous with a death sentence. But when the lights of Showtime Lakers shone the brightest, that was also when the shadows began to grow longer behind Magic Johnson. Throughout the 1980s, he was no longer just an outstanding basketball player. He became a global icon. Kids across America wore number 32 jerseys. Television commercials invited him to appear. His name graced magazine covers, talk shows, and conversations among sports fans everywhere. Magic Johnson at that time didn't just represent the Los Angeles Lakers. He represented an entire era of the NBA. But fame has a very quiet way of changing a person's life. When someone becomes too famous, the world around them starts operating by different rules. For Magic Johnson, Los Angeles wasn't just a place to play. It was a new world full of lights, music, parties that stretched until dawn, and doors always wide open for a young superstar. Hollywood nightclubs, lavish parties, and encounters with movie stars became familiar parts of his life. After every game, when the fans had left the arena and the stage lights dimmed, Magic Johnson's life stepped onto another stage, one without a scoreboard, without referees, and without clear boundaries. In his 20s, with money, fame, and admiration pouring in from everywhere, Magic Johnson lived in a world few young people could resist. Parties that went on, spontaneous trips, relationships that came and went as quickly as camera flashes. The media at the time often described his life as the perfect American dream, a guy from a working-class neighborhood who became a superstar in America's most glamorous city. But behind that image, the pressure grew heavier every day. Every season the Lakers had to win. Every game, Magic had to prove he was still the best player on the court. Every day the media waited for a new story about his life. Articles started following not just what he did on the court, but what he did off it too. For a young man, living under the eyes of the entire world wasn't always easy. And sometimes decisions made in seemingly harmless moments carried consequences no one could foresee. In those years, Magic Johnson still played brilliantly. He kept winning, kept raising championship trophies, and kept making fans believe he was the embodiment of joy in basketball. But life off the court began to grow far more complicated than the perfect passes he made during games. Personal relationships, endless parties, and the breakneck pace of Los Angeles started creating a gap between the superstar image the world saw and the real person he was. There were nights Magic Johnson came home after a long party and wondered how long all of this could last. But then the next morning he'd wake up, put on his Lakers jersey, and step onto the court as if everything was fine. The crowd still cheered, the media still praised, and the Showtime Lakers dynasty kept rolling. The world saw the light, but very few noticed that in those years, fate was quietly writing another chapter in Magic Johnson's story. Because sometimes, seemingly small decisions during the most successful years can change an entire life. And for Magic Johnson, the partying, fame and complicated relationships of the 1980s would not just be memories of a young superstar. They would become the beginning of a fateful moment, the moment the whole world would stop, listen and never look at him the same way again. The years of light, fame and parties in the 1980s ultimately led to one morning that the sports world would later call the day everything stopped. November 7, 1991 began like any other day in Magic Johnson's life. But in just a few short hours, his life and the way all of America viewed sports, health and a terrifying disease changed forever. That morning, reporters were called to an emergency press conference by the Los Angeles Lakers. No one knew exactly what was happening. Some thought it was just an injury announcement. Others guessed Magic Johnson might be preparing for a major career decision. But when he walked into the press room, his face more serious than anyone had ever seen, many began to sense that what was about to be said wouldn't be like any sports news they'd ever heard. Magic Johnson sat down in front of dozens of microphones and television cameras. The man who had brought the brightest smiles to the NBA now spoke slowly, calmly, but every word he uttered felt heavy as stone. He said he had just received test results. He said he had tested positive for HIV. And in just a few brief seconds, the room fell so silent you could hear the cameras running. When the words "I have HIV" left his lips, all of America seemed to freeze. In 1991, HIV was still a disease many saw as a death sentence. Television stories often ended in death. Hospitals full of frail patients, families in agony watching loved ones slip away. And now the man who had made the entire NBA explode with no-look passes was telling the world he had the disease too. Magic Johnson was only 32 years old. He was still at the peak of his career. He was still the heart of the Lakers. And just one day earlier, people were still talking about him as one of the greatest players to ever play the game. But now the question wasn't how many more championships he would win. The question became how much longer would he live. In that press conference, Magic Johnson kept speaking. He said he would immediately retire from the NBA. He said he wanted to live long enough to see his son grow up. He said he hoped his story would help people understand HIV better. But behind those calm words, everyone could feel the weight of the moment. A 32-year-old superstar who had just helped define an entire NBA era was saying goodbye to his career before his body had even forced him to. When the press conference ended, the news spread faster than any fast break Magic Johnson had ever run on the court. Television channels broke in with urgent reports. Newspapers printed special editions. Sports shows across America stopped all game analysis to talk about one thing: Magic Johnson has HIV. For many fans, it was an unbelievable shock. The man who always smiled, always brimmed with energy, always made everything on the court fun, was now facing a disease the whole world feared at the time. In the days that followed, the public reaction was like a massive wave. Some expressed support and sympathy, others were confused, even frightened. Many began asking whether someone with HIV could continue playing sports. Television programs debated non-stop. Medical experts appeared to explain a disease few had understood before. But somewhere amid all those discussions, Magic Johnson was still just a man trying to face the new reality of his life. In the early days after the announcement, he had to learn to live with a truth he had never imagined before. He had to accept that the career he had built from concrete courts in Lansing had ended after just one morning. He had to confront the fear that millions of people with HIV around the world carried every day: fear of time. In 1991, many doctors still believed people with HIV might only live a few more years. And when the whole world looked at Magic Johnson, many thought the same. They thought the Lakers legend might have only a very short road left. But what few realized in that dark moment was that Magic Johnson was still doing what he had always done throughout his life, facing the challenge instead of running from it. In the press conference, though his voice lowered and his eyes no longer shone like they did on the court, one thing was familiar: determination. He didn't deny the fear, but he also didn't let fear define him. And while all of America thought Magic Johnson's story might be nearing its end, the reality was something completely different. Because November 7, 1991 wasn't just the day Magic Johnson's basketball career stopped, it was also the day a battle began that would last more than 3 decades. A battle between one man and a disease the world once believed no one could defeat. But after the press conference on November 7, 1991, when the cameras turned off and the reporters left the room, another phase of Magic Johnson's life began, one without stadium lights, without cheers, and without a scoreboard to show he was winning. It was years of fear, of silence, and of a world that still didn't understand the disease he was carrying. The 1990s were a time when HIV was still shrouded in confusion and stigma. Many people didn't fully understand how the disease was transmitted. Television often only showed stories that ended in death. And in the public's mind back then, HIV was almost synonymous with a slow death sentence. When Magic Johnson announced he had HIV, he didn't just face the disease itself, he also had to face society's fear. Some fans sent encouraging letters, saying they were praying for him. But there were other reactions, cold ones, full of anxiety. In the basketball world, some players started asking questions no one had thought of before. Was it safe to play against someone with HIV? Some said they were afraid of contact on the court. Some worried about scratches or blood during games. Those questions quickly became topics of debate on sports shows, and while the whole country argued, Magic Johnson had to learn to live with the fact that his illness was no longer private. The media relentlessly asked cruel questions, not about his assists, not about his championships, but one cold question repeated across headlines: how much longer will Magic Johnson live? For a man used to hearing cheers every time he stepped onto the court, hearing questions like that was a completely different experience. And in the early days after the announcement, even Magic Johnson didn't know the answer. Doctors said HIV could progress to AIDS in a few years. Treatments back then were limited, and very few people in the world lived long with the disease. In quiet nights, when the TV cameras were off and the phone stopped ringing non-stop, Magic Johnson sometimes lay awake thinking about something he'd never considered before: death. He was only 32 years old. He had just left a career he'd built his whole life, and now he faced a future no one could predict. He later admitted that in those early days, real fear existed. There were moments he believed he might not live to see 40. There were times he thought about his family, about his son, and wondered if he'd get to see the boy grow up. Those thoughts weren't like any pressure he'd ever faced in basketball. On the court, there was always a chance for a fast break. But with this disease, Magic Johnson didn't know if there would be a second chance. In the first months after retiring, his life slowed down in a strange way. No more packed schedules, no more red-eye flights, no more roaring arenas. Instead, there were doctor appointments, blood tests, and long talks about health. For someone who'd lived at the NBA's frantic pace, that silence was almost terrifying. But it was also in that silence that Magic Johnson began to think differently. He started reading more about HIV. He talked to doctors, scientists, and others living with the disease. And gradually, he realized something important: if he just lived in fear, the disease would win before the real fight even started. While the media kept asking how much time he had left, Magic Johnson began searching for another way to face his life. But that path wasn't easy, because in the early 1990s, HIV wasn't just a medical condition, it was a social scar, something that made many people turn away out of fear. And for a superstar who had stood at the peak of world sports, stepping out of the spotlight to live in doubt and silence was a challenge few could fully understand. But what the world didn't realize then was that Magic Johnson hadn't said his final word. The years of fear and doubt were only the first chapter of another journey, one that would ultimately transform him from a basketball superstar into a symbol of hope for millions around the world. But after months immersed in fear and silence, when the whole world was wondering if Magic Johnson's story had truly ended, an unexpected opportunity appeared, not just to return to the court, but to prove that his life hadn't closed yet. In 1992, the sports world turned to the city of Barcelona in Spain, where the Summer Olympics were about to take place. It was a special Olympics because for the first time in history, professional NBA players were allowed to join the United States men's national basketball team, and the roster assembled then quickly became known around the world by a name that would later become legendary: the United States men's Olympic basketball team, 1992. It wasn't just a team, it was a collection of the greatest players on the planet. In that locker room were names that commanded respect across the basketball world: Michael Jordan, dominating the NBA with the Chicago Bulls; Larry Bird, the old rival, who had created those legendary finals matchups with Magic Johnson throughout the 1980s, along with many other stars of the league. But what made that lineup even more special was the presence of Magic Johnson. Just a few months earlier, he had said goodbye to the NBA because of HIV. Many believed he would never play at a high level again, and now he was preparing to step onto the court with the strongest team ever assembled in basketball history. When the Dream Team arrived in Barcelona, the atmosphere felt more like a global spectacle than a sports competition. Thousands of fans crowded around the hotel just to catch a glimpse of the players. Kids asked for autographs. Reporters from around the world followed every practice. But amid all those superstars, Magic Johnson was still the name that drew special attention, not because of his titles, but because of the question the whole world still had no answer to: was he really healthy? Could he still play like before? And as the Dream Team's first games began, the answer slowly emerged. Magic Johnson stepped onto the court with his familiar smile, passing quickly, moving fluidly, and controlling the game's tempo just as he had throughout his career. His assists made the Barcelona crowds leap to their feet. His no-look passes reminded the whole world why they called him Magic. The Dream Team quickly proved they were far superior to the rest of the world. They won every game by large margins. Opponents were overwhelmed by the speed and skill of the NBA players, and every time Magic Johnson took the floor, the crowd cheered as if they were witnessing a miracle, because for so many people, the fact that he was still playing in the Olympics was already a miracle. In the Olympic final, the Dream Team won convincingly, and brought home the gold medal for the United States. The players stood on the podium as the national anthem played, and there, among basketball's legends, Magic Johnson stood smiling, not as the symbol of fear many had once thought, but as a symbol of life. The world then began to realize something important: Magic Johnson was still here, he was still standing on the court, he was still smiling, and he was still playing the kind of basketball that made entire arenas stand up. Barcelona 1992 wasn't just an Olympic victory. For Magic Johnson, it was an affirmation that the disease couldn't define his entire life. It was a reminder that the man the whole world once believed would disappear in a few years could still rise and compete in front of millions. And as the Dream Team left Barcelona with gold medals, Magic Johnson's story also moved into a new chapter. No longer just the story of a basketball superstar, but the story of a man beginning to prove that the biggest battle of his life was far from over. After the roaring cheers in Barcelona in 1992, when the Olympic lights slowly faded and the athletes returned home, Magic Johnson's life stepped into another silence, a silence far deeper than any off-season he had ever known. For nearly 2 decades before that, his life had always been measured by starting whistles, electronic scoreboards, and red-eye flights from one city to the next. But after the Olympics, when the practices ended and no schedule waited for him, Magic Johnson had to face a truth he had never prepared for: life after basketball. For almost 20 years, basketball wasn't just his job, it was the heartbeat of his existence. From the concrete courts in Lansing to the blazing arenas of the Los Angeles Lakers, every day of Magic Johnson's life revolved around that orange ball. But now, suddenly, everything stopped. No more noisy locker rooms before games. No more crowds rising when he threw a no-look pass. No more practices stretching into the night. Life became so quiet it felt almost unfamiliar. In the first months after leaving the court, Magic Johnson admitted he felt lost. A huge part of who he was had been built around playing. When that vanished, He had to learn to understand himself again. There were mornings he woke up and for the first few seconds still thought he had to prepare for a game. But then he remembered the season was over. Not just that season, but perhaps his entire career. No more arenas, no more cheers, just the silence of a new life he didn't yet know how to live. And along with that silence came questions. Magic Johnson began wondering what would happen next. He was still young, just past 30. But HIV made the future feel fragile. Many people back then still believed he only had a few years left. For someone used to planning season by season, not knowing how long his future would last was an indescribable feeling. But it was precisely in that foggy period that Magic Johnson started seeing life from a different angle. With no schedule, he had more time with his family. He had time to think about things his busy NBA routine had never allowed. He remembered his childhood days in Lansing, when his father worked at the General Motors plant and his mother took on multiple jobs to feed the family. He remembered the boy who ran to the court just to dream of a better life. And gradually, Magic Johnson began to understand that his life couldn't be defined only by basketball. The titles, the trophies, and the great finals would always be part of history. But if his life ended there, his story wouldn't be complete. So he started learning to live again from the beginning. Not as a player, but as a person searching for a new purpose. Those early days weren't easy at all. Without the court, he had to create a different rhythm for himself. He read more, met with health experts, and learned about the HIV he was carrying. He began speaking with community organizations, with people living with HIV, and with families facing the same fear he had once felt. And in those conversations, Magic Johnson realized his story could bring hope to far more people than he had ever imagined. Because when one of the world's most famous athletes stood before the public and said he was living with HIV, forced society to look at the disease in a different way. But the road ahead was still unclear. Magic Johnson still didn't know exactly who he would become after basketball. He only knew one thing: if he was still alive, then his life still had meaning. And so step by step he began rebuilding his life, not on the court, but in the vast world beyond it. What Magic Johnson didn't know then was that the next chapter of his life wouldn't just make him successful again. It would turn him into one of the most influential former athletes in business and community in America. But at that moment, all he was doing was simply learning to stand up once more, in a life without starting whistles. But as Magic Johnson's life gradually moved away from the basketball court, something else began to take shape in the silence. After the disoriented months following retirement, he realized his life couldn't just stop at the past. Basketball had given him fame, but it couldn't be the final chapter of his story. And just like when he was a boy in Lansing standing before cracked concrete courts, Magic Johnson once again began thinking about the future with one simple question: if there's no more basketball, who will I become? The answer didn't come right away. In the early years after retiring, he tried many different paths. He appeared on television, he attended community events, he talked with investors and entrepreneurs. And in those meetings, Magic Johnson began to realize that the business world was like basketball in one important way. It required vision, patience, and the ability to read situations faster than others. So he decided to step into a field few thought a former basketball player would succeed in business. Step by step, he began building the foundation for his own business empire. He founded a company called Magic Johnson Enterprises, an organization designed to invest in various sectors, from real estate and entertainment to sports. At first, many people were skeptical. In the public's eyes back then, Magic Johnson was still an athlete, a Los Angeles Lakers legend, not a businessman. But Magic Johnson understood something many didn't throughout all those years playing basketball. He had learned how to lead, how to spot opportunities, and how to make quick decisions under pressure. And those skills could be applied to business. In the years that followed, Magic Johnson Enterprises grew rapidly. He invested in movie theater chains, shopping centers, and development projects in urban communities, places big investors had often overlooked before. Magic Johnson believed those neighborhoods deserved the same economic opportunities as anywhere else. And that strategy quickly proved effective. His projects started turning profits. Business partners realized that Magic Johnson didn't just bring fame, he brought vision. Gradually, his reputation in the business world grew almost as fast as it had when he played basketball. But the biggest turning point came when he returned to the sports world, this time not as a player, but as an investor. Magic Johnson became part of the ownership group for the Los Angeles Dodgers, one of America's oldest and most famous sports brands. For many sports fans, seeing Magic Johnson, the NBA legend, appear as an owner of a baseball team was surprising. But for him it was just the next step in his journey. He also invested in the women's basketball team Los Angeles Sparks, helping grow the WNBA and expanding his influence in sports. Later he became one of the investors in Los Angeles FC when the club was founded in Major League Soccer. Step by step, Magic Johnson didn't just return to the sports world, he returned as someone shaping it. As the years passed, his business empire continued to expand. Magic Johnson Enterprises grew into an investment company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And what surprised many the most was how he used that success. He didn't invest just to make money. He invested to create economic opportunities in the communities he understood so well, communities like the one he grew up in. Gradually, one truth became clear: Magic Johnson had reinvented himself, no longer just a great basketball player, not just a survivor of HIV, he became a highly influential businessman in the American economy, and over time his wealth grew significantly, making him one of the richest former athletes in the world. But for Magic Johnson, the most important thing wasn't the numbers in his bank account. The important thing was that he had proven life doesn't end when one door closes. The boy who once played on concrete courts in Lansing had conquered the NBA, and when basketball ended, he started another game, one in the business world, where vision, perseverance, and belief in the future once again helped him win. But while the world praised Magic Johnson's rebirth as a businessman, there was still something deeper keeping him grounded through all those years: family, the people who had been with him long before he became a legend, and who were still there when the arena lights went out. But amid all the new success in business, amid the big deals and meetings with investors, there is one truth Magic Johnson has always understood very clearly: without family, he very likely would never have had the chance to stand up again. Throughout his life, from the poor boy in Lansing to the superstar of the Los Angeles Lakers, Magic Johnson had grown accustomed to standing under the spotlight. But when HIV appeared, and that light began to feel cold, family became the only place that made him feel safe. And at the center of that family was the woman who had been by his side long before the whole world knew the name Magic Johnson, Cookie Johnson. Cookie wasn't someone who appeared after Magic Johnson became a superstar. She was there from the days when he was still a young man with big dreams and an uncertain future. The two met when they were very young, and their relationship grew during the years Magic Johnson was building his career. But what makes their story special isn't the days of glory. It's the darkest moment of his life. When Magic Johnson received his HIV test results in 1991, one of his greatest fears wasn't that his career would end, it was having to tell Cookie. When he sat down and told her the truth, he didn't know what would happen next. The world back then was full of fear about HIV. Many people didn't even understand how the disease spread, and Magic Johnson knew his words could change everything in their marriage. But Cookie Johnson's reaction became one of the most important moments in his life. She didn't walk away. She didn't turn her back. Instead, she chose to stay. She said they would face everything together. And while the whole world doubted Magic Johnson's future, that woman became the first to believe he could still go on living, still keep fighting, and still hold on to hope. In the early days after the 1991 press conference, when the media kept talking about his disease, and when many people started looking at him with worry or fear, family became the only place Magic Johnson could truly breathe. In his home, he wasn't an NBA superstar. He wasn't a symbol of a disease the whole world was discussing. He was just a husband, a father, a human being trying to figure out where his life was headed. Evenings with family became more precious than ever. No more red-eye flights, no more packed game schedules. Instead, there were meals, conversations, and quiet moments he had rarely had time to enjoy before. It was in those moments that Magic Johnson began to realize something he hadn't fully understood before. Fame can come and go, but family is the one thing that truly stays. Cookie Johnson wasn't just the wife standing by him in hard times. She became the person who helped him find balance in life again. When he worried about his health, she reminded him the fight wasn't over. When he felt tired from the media attention, she reminded him there was still so much worth living for. And when he began building his business career, she was still there, just like when he was a young player in Los Angeles. Over time, their family continued to grow. Their children became the center of the life Magic Johnson was rebuilding after basketball. And every time he looked at them, he remembered why he had to keep fighting in those early years after learning he had HIV. Family didn't just give him love, they gave him purpose. While the world sees Magic Johnson as an icon, a basketball legend, a successful businessman, an HIV survivor, his family sees him differently. They see the man behind all those titles, the man who still has fears, the man who sometimes still remembers the days playing ball in Lansing, the man who still needs a place to come home to after all the games of his life. And that's why, through all the years of glory and crisis, family has been Magic Johnson's refuge. Not the arena, not the boardrooms of businessmen, but the home where he can set down all the pressures of the world and simply be a husband, a father, and a human being who knows that no matter how life changes, there are people who will never leave him. And perhaps that's exactly what helped him keep moving forward when so many once believed he would never get the chance to go this far. The years passed after the events that seemed like they could break Magic Johnson's life, and the world gradually realized his story wasn't like any other that had ever happened in sports. When he stood before the microphones on November 7, 1991 and said he had HIV, many believed they were witnessing the final chapter of a legend. Doctors back then talked about the few years he might have left. The media asked cold questions about time, and fans, no matter how much they loved him, couldn't escape the fear that that radiant smile would soon vanish from the world. But then the years went by. 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, and Magic Johnson was still there. He still appeared in public. He still worked, still smiled, still lived a life full of energy. What at first surprised many people gradually became a bigger question: how could a man the whole world once believed would die young keep living so strongly? The answer isn't in magic, it's in the decision Magic Johnson made after that fateful day in 1991. Instead of letting the disease define his life, he chose to turn it into part of his mission. In the years after announcing his HIV status, Magic Johnson began speaking publicly about a disease many had only dared to whisper about before. He appeared on television, in schools, at health conferences, and in community campaigns. He talked about testing, he talked about prevention, and most importantly, he said that people living with HIV aren't people who have lost hope. At that time that meant an enormous amount, because in the early 1990s, HIV was still surrounded by fear and stigma. Many believed just touching someone with the disease could spread it. Families kept secrets out of fear of being shunned by society. But when one of the world's most famous athletes stood before the public and said he was living with HIV, it forced society to rethink. Magic Johnson didn't just talk, he acted. He founded charitable organizations and research funds to support communities and raise awareness about HIV. He invested in health education programs in urban neighborhoods, where the disease often hit hardest, and step by step the image of HIV in the public eye began to change. It was no longer just sad news stories on television. It was no longer just a disease hidden in silence. It became a battle people could face with knowledge, science, and hope. Throughout the 3 decades after that fateful press conference, Magic Johnson became a symbol of something few thought possible before: living long and living well with HIV. Medical advances helped make treatment more effective, but it was his courage in speaking about the disease that helped change how the world viewed it. Young people got better educated, patients felt less alone, and society slowly understood that HIV isn't the end of a life. By then, what the world had quietly doubted for so many years finally became clear. Magic Johnson didn't just survive. He turned a sentence many once thought inescapable into a journey of hope. He turned fear into strength. He turned the disease into a mission. And while many remember him as a Los Angeles Lakers legend, perhaps Magic Johnson's greatest legacy isn't on the court. It's in the millions of lives inspired by his story, the story of a man who refused to let darkness decide his ending. But even after all of that, Magic Johnson's story still isn't truly over, because what makes his life the most extraordinary isn't just that he survived. It's the way he continues to live with the belief that every day left is another chance to prove that hope is always stronger than fear. 3 decades have passed since the day the whole world believed Magic Johnson's story might be coming to an end, but time has written a completely different ending. Now, at 66, the man who once made Los Angeles Lakers arenas explode with no-look passes is remembered not only as a basketball legend. He has become a symbol of what many once thought impossible: survival. When looking back on Magic Johnson's life, it's easy to start with the numbers: 5 NBA championships, 3 MVP awards, 12 All-Star appearances, one of the greatest playmakers in basketball history. Those achievements are enough to ensure his name forever belongs in the pantheon of sports legends. But if the story stopped at trophies and stat sheets, Magic Johnson's tale would only be that of an exceptional athlete, and his life has gone far beyond that, because the most important moment in Magic Johnson's story didn't happen on the court. It happened in a press conference room in 1991, when he spoke the 2 words the whole world feared back then: HIV. On that day, many believed they were watching the end of a legend, but in reality, it was only the beginning of another chapter, one where Magic Johnson had to fight not against opposing teams, but against society's fear, and against his own body. In the years that followed, he lived with what many considered a death sentence. But day after day, Magic Johnson kept standing strong. He rebuilt his life after basketball. He became a successful businessman, turning Magic Johnson Enterprises into a major investment empire. He became part of the ownership groups for major sports teams like the Los Angeles Dodgers, the Los Angeles Sparks, and Los Angeles FC. He invested in communities that big investors had often ignored before. He used his fame to raise awareness about HIV, and helped millions understand that this disease doesn't have to be the end of a life. But perhaps what makes Magic Johnson's story the most special isn't the money or the fame, it's the way he lived. For so many years he refused to let his illness become a reason to stop. He didn't hide from the world. Instead, he stepped in front of the public, spoke openly about HIV, and turned his story into a source of hope for others. For millions of people living with HIV around the world, Magic Johnson isn't just a famous person with the disease. He is living proof that life can go on, that hope still exists, that a person can rise even when the whole world thinks they've fallen. And when people look at Magic Johnson today, a man still full of energy, still smiling, still working, and still inspiring, they begin to understand that his true legacy isn't in the games he won, it's in the battles he survived. Because in sports, people usually remember the moments of victory, but in life, the most powerful stories come from those who refuse to stay down. Magic Johnson won on the basketball court, where his passes changed the way the whole world looked at the point guard position. But his greater victory happened off the court, in the years when he faced a disease the whole world once thought unbeatable. And so, when his story is told, it isn't just the story of an NBA legend. It's the story of a man who proved that real strength doesn't lie only in talent, but in the ability to keep living when everything seems to have ended. There's a saying often brought up when people talk about legends, that legends are remembered for the games they win. But Magic Johnson's story reminds us that isn't entirely true. Legends are not remembered for the games they win. They are remembered for the battles they survive. And if that's true, then Magic Johnson isn't just a basketball legend. He is the man who refused to die when the whole world thought he would die young. A poor boy from Lansing who became an NBA superstar, an HIV patient who became a symbol of hope, and a human being tested by fate many times who proved that life isn't measured by the times we fall, but by the times we get back up. Magic Johnson won on the basketball court, but his greatest victory was the battle against death itself, and the fact that he's still here to tell his own story. The story of Magic Johnson isn't just a great sports journey, it's also an emotional record of human fragility in the face of fate. When looking back on his entire life, what touches people with both heartache and admiration isn't just the titles with the Los Angeles Lakers or the 5 NBA championships during the Showtime era, but the moment in 1991 when a 32-year-old man had to stand before the whole world and say he had HIV. At that time, HIV was almost seen as a death sentence, and many believed both his career and his life had reached their conclusion. That sense of sorrow runs even deeper when remembering that before all that, he was just a boy growing up in a poor family in Lansing, where his father worked at the General Motors plant, and his mother took on multiple jobs to feed 9 children. It was from that background that he stepped into the world, overcame high school mockery, became an NCAA hero after the finals against Larry Bird, then stunned the entire NBA by winning Finals MVP as a rookie. So when he announced his HIV diagnosis, the pain wasn't just his, it belonged to an entire generation of fans. However, what makes Magic Johnson's story truly great isn't that tragedy, but the way he turned it into a mission. He didn't hide from the illness, didn't live in silence. He stood up and spoke about HIV, built Magic Johnson Enterprises, invested in teams like the Los Angeles Dodgers, and helped change the way society views the disease. For the people of America, the lesson from that story is very clear. A person's strength isn't measured by victories on the court, but by how they rise when life seems to have ended. Magic Johnson reminds us that hope, responsibility to the community, and love for family can turn even the most terrifying sentence into a journey of courage and faith. If the story of Magic Johnson and his journey from darkness to becoming a symbol of hope has touched your heart, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring stories. Thank you for watching until the end of the video, and see you again in the next story about people who turned adversity into strength.